She hit the ground so hard the tin flew from her hands, and the biscuit recipe her mother had written in fading ink scattered across the mud like it meant nothing. Nobody moved. 20 men stood at that gate, and not one of them reached down. Nell Whitaker pressed her palms into the cold Colorado dirt, blood rushing to her face, dress soaked through, and made herself a promise, so quiet nobody heard it. I am not leaving. If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next will stay with you for a long time. The mud was cold. That was the first thing Nell Whitaker felt when her knees hit the ground outside the gates of Redstone Valley Ranch on the morning of June the 3rd, 1884. Not humiliation, not rage, not fear. Just the cold, wet, unforgiving mud of a Colorado morning seeping through her dress and into her skin, like the land itself was trying to swallow her whole. She had walked 11 miles to get here. 11 miles in boots that had worn thin at the heels 3 months ago. 11 miles with a canvas bag on her shoulder that held everything she owned in this world. A change of dress, a tin of her mother's recipes held shut with a piece of ribbon, $4.62, and a letter of introduction that had been rained on twice and was barely legible anymore. She had not eaten since yesterday morning, and now she was on her knees in the mud with 20 ranch hands standing around her, some of them laughing, some of them just watching, and not a single one of them reaching down to help. The man who had pushed her was still standing over her. His name was Graham Pike, and he wore the title of foreman. The way some men wore a crown, like it gave him the right to treat everyone beneath him as less than human. He was a broad man, thick through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same hard rock as the Colorado mountains behind him. He had small eyes that missed nothing and felt nothing. "I told you once," Graham said, and his voice carried across the yard like he wanted every man there to hear it. "I ain't telling you again. This is a working ranch. We don't take on strays." Nell heard the laughter ripple through the men around her. She pressed her palms flat against the mud and breathed. She had heard worse, from harder men than this one. Her father had called her worthless every day for the first 16 years of her life. The family she'd worked for in Denver had dismissed her without wages and called her a thief when she wasn't, and she'd had to walk away from that with nothing because she had no one to stand beside her and call them liars. The man she'd believed loved her had taken her best years and her savings and left her with a note that didn't even use her name. Graham Pike and his mean little eyes were nothing she hadn't already survived. Nell reached out, picked up her recipe. The lid had come open, and one of the index cards had landed in a puddle, her mother's handwriting bleeding at the edges, and she closed it carefully. She tucked it under her arm. She put one foot under her body and stood up. She did not wipe her face. She did not look at the ground. She looked directly at Graham Pike and said, "I'd like to speak with Mr. Mercer." More laughter, louder this time. "Mr. Mercer," Graham repeated, drawing the name out slow and mocking. "Don't see visitors who come crawling through the mud on their hands and knees." "Then I'll wait until he does." Something shifted in Graham's expression. It wasn't respect. It wasn't even surprise. It was something colder than both, the particular look of a man who realizes that cruelty has not done what he expected it to do. "You'll wait," he said flatly. "Yes, sir," Nell said. "I will." She walked 5 paces back toward the gate, turned so she was facing the ranch house, and stood there. The laughter died. The men drifted back to their work, looking over their shoulders at her. Graham watched her for a long moment, his jaw tight, then turned and walked toward the barn with the stiff stride of a man who had not gotten what he came for. Nell stood at that gate for 2 hours. The sun climbed. Her dress began to dry, the mud stiffening against the fabric. Her feet ached. Her stomach was a clenched fist beneath her ribs. She did not sit down. She did not pace. She simply stood facing that ranch house with the recipe tin held against her chest and her eyes fixed on the front door like she could will it open by sheer force of wanting. She was still standing there when Caleb Mercer finally came out. She knew him the moment she saw him. Not because she had ever met him, she hadn't. But there are men who carry their authority in the way they move, and Caleb Mercer was one of them. He came down the porch steps and across the yard with the unhurried stride of a man who owned the ground under his feet and had never had reason to doubt it. He was taller than Graham by half a head, lean in the way that hard work makes a man lean, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that had spent 40 years in the Colorado sun, and looked it. He stopped a few feet away from her and looked at her the way she imagined he looked at everything, taking stock, assessing, deciding. "You the woman been standing at my gate," he said. "Yes, sir." "For 2 hours." "About that." He looked at her dress, at the dried mud, at the tin she was holding. "Graham says you're looking for cook work." "I am." "We had a cook." "I know. He left 3 weeks ago. Before him there were 2 others in 8 months. Word gets around." Something moved through his eyes. Not offense. More like the careful attention of a man who has just heard something he wasn't expecting. "Does it?" he said. "Yes, sir. The men at Miller's Crossing talk. So do the men at the trading post in Hartfield. When workers leave a ranch, they say why. And the why isn't always what the ranch owner thinks it is." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "And what do you think the why is?" he asked. Nell held his gaze. "I think your men are hungry. Not just in their stomachs. I think they've been eating bad food for so long that they've started feeling like the bad food is what they're worth. And men who feel worthless don't stay anywhere very long." The silence stretched between them. A horse moved in the corral nearby. Somewhere in the barn, a man was hammering something. The wind came down off the mountains and lifted the brim of Caleb's hat slightly, and he put one hand up to hold it. "That's a bold thing to say to a man you've never met," he said finally. "I know it is. You got references." "I have a letter." She reached into her bag and produced it, handing it over. It was creased and watermarked, and she watched his face as he read it, trying to gauge his reaction. He handed it back without comment. "What's in the tin?" he said. She looked down at it. "My mother's recipes. She spent 30 years cooking for families on the frontier. She wrote everything down. And you cook like your mother." "I cook better than my mother," Nell said. "And she was the best cook I ever knew." For the first time, something that might have been a smile crossed his face. It was small and gone almost immediately, but she caught it. "That's either confidence," he said, "or foolishness." "It's honesty," she said. "You can decide which later." Caleb looked at her for another long moment. Then he turned and looked back toward the house. "I got 23 men to feed twice a day," he said, still looking away. "I got a kitchen that hasn't been properly run in months. I got supplies that have been poorly managed and waste I can't afford. And I got men whose morale is—" He stopped, started again. "The situation is not good." "I know," Nell said quietly. "That's why I'm here." He turned back to look at her. "You can't be worse than what I've had," he said. "No, sir," she agreed. "I cannot. If you can make something worth keeping by supper," he said, "you can stay the night. We'll talk wages in the morning." He paused. "You understand that's the only offer I'm making?" "I understand." He nodded once sharp, like a man ending a conversation. "Kitchen's through the back," he said, and walked away. Nell exhaled slowly. She turned and looked at the gate behind her, at the road stretching away across the open land, at the mountains in the distance, blue and enormous against the sky. Then she picked up her bag, adjusted the recipe tin under her arm, and walked toward the back of the ranch house. The kitchen was not what she had hoped for, and it was exactly what she had expected. It was a large room, which was the only good thing she could say about it immediately. There was a wide iron stove along one wall that had clearly been a fine piece of equipment at some point in its life, but had not been properly cleaned in a very long time. The prep table in the center was scarred and stained. The shelves were disorganized cans, stacked without order, sacks of flour and cornmeal, left open, a side of salt pork, hanging near a window that wasn't kept cold enough and had started to turn at the edges. She found a partial barrel of lard that had gone rancid. She found dried beans that had been stored in a cracked container and had absorbed moisture, which meant they would take twice as long to cook and taste like nothing when they were done. She found the remnants of the last cook's repertoire, a style of cooking. so relentlessly tasteless and careless, that she could understand in a single glance around that kitchen exactly why men were packing their bags and walking away. It wasn't just bad food. It was food that said, "You don't matter enough for anyone to try." She set her bag down on the cleanest corner of the prep table. She set the tin beside it. She took off her coat, hung it on a hook near the door, and rolled up her sleeves. Then she went to work. The first thing she did was not cook. The first thing she did was clean. She built up the fire in the stove and heated water, and she scrubbed that kitchen with a focused, systematic fury that was also a kind of prayer. She threw out the rancid lard. She reorganized the shelves. She took stock of what was actually usable, the genuine inventory. Not what was supposed to be there, but what actually was. And she did it quickly because she was already thinking 3 steps ahead. She had maybe 4 hours before supper. She found good flour, not much, but enough. She found a small crock of butter that was still sound. She found buttermilk in the cold cellar beneath the kitchen, 2 full jugs of it, more than she needed. She smiled when she found that buttermilk. It was a small smile, tired and private, but real. "All right, Mama," she said quietly to no one. "Let's see what we can do." She pulled out her mother's recipe card for buttermilk biscuits, even though she didn't need to. She had made these biscuits so many times since she was 7 years old that she could have made them blind, made them in her sleep, made them with both hands tied behind her back. But she looked at the card anyway, at her mother's careful slanted handwriting, at the small note at the bottom of the card that said in ink that had faded to almost nothing, "Always make more than you think you need. There is always someone hungrier than you expect." She started with the biscuits because she knew what they could do. She had seen it her whole life, the way a good biscuit could change the temperature of a room, the way it could cut through exhaustion and bad tempers, and men who'd been too long away from anything tender. There was something about a proper biscuit hot from the oven that reached past all of a person's defenses and touched something they'd maybe forgotten was still there. She worked the dough with her hands, feeling for the right texture, not too much, not too little, the way her mother had drilled into her. She cut them and laid them in the pan, and while they baked, she put together a pot of beans that would be simple but seasoned properly, and she fried up the better portions of the salt pork with onions she found in the cold cellar, and she brewed coffee that was actually strong enough to be called coffee. She was still at the stove when the first man came in. He came in the way men come into spaces they've learned not to expect anything good from: shoulders slightly hunched, eyes down, moving quickly like he wanted to get in and get out. I was young, maybe 19, with a sunburned neck and hands that were rough and cracked from outdoor work. He stopped just inside the door. The smell hit him. She watched his face change. "Ma'am," he said uncertainly. "Sit down," she said without turning from the stove. "Supper's in about 10 minutes. He hesitated. "It smells—" He stopped, apparently not finding the right words. "Like food," she suggested. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "Like real food." He sat down. By the time the biscuits came out of the oven, there were 6 men at the table. By the time she started serving, there were 14. She had made extra. She had made them in 2 pans, twice what she'd originally planned, because her mother's note was in her head, and she knew she was cooking for hungry men in more ways than one. She put the basket of biscuits on the table herself. Hot golden, the smell of them filling every corner of the room. There was a moment, a particular suspended moment, where every man at that table went completely still. Then the young man with the sunburned neck reached out and picked one up. He broke it open. Steam rose from inside it. He didn't say anything. He just looked at it for a second, and then he took a bite, and something crossed his face that was so unguarded and so raw that Nell had to look away. The room broke open after that. There was talking. Real talking. Not the kind of grudging exchanges exhausted men make when they're sharing a table out of necessity, but actual conversation, animated and overlapping. Men reaching past each other for the beans, trading comments about the salt pork. One man saying something that made 2 others laugh, a real laugh, the kind that started in the chest. Nell stood at the edge of the room and watched it. She felt it the way she always felt it, this thing that good food could do. This small miracle of it. She didn't hear Caleb Mercer come in. She didn't hear him at all until he was standing beside her, And even then, it was only the particular quality of the silence around him. The way men straightened slightly when he walked in, that made her turn and see him there. He was standing with his arms crossed watching his men. His face was complicated in a way she couldn't entirely read. There was something there that looked almost like pain. "How long has it been like this?" she asked him, quietly, so only he could hear. He didn't answer right away. "Like what?" "What?" he said finally. "Since they've talked to each other at the supper table." He looked at her. Then he looked back at his men. "A while," he said. She nodded. She thought about letting it be, about leaving it there and walking back to the stove and keeping her head down, the way she had learned you had to do when you were new somewhere and had no power and needed to be careful. But she had been careful her whole life, and careful had left her walking 11 miles with $4 in her pocket and a letter no one wanted to read. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "can I tell you something?" He looked at her. "It's not the cattle," she said. "It's not the drought. It's not the market prices or the fence line or whatever else your foreman has been telling you is the problem." She glanced at the table, at the men. Men can endure hard work. They can endure hard weather. They can endure being tired and sore and a long way from home. What they can't endure, what nobody can endure, is feeling like they don't matter to anyone. Like they're just useful parts of something that doesn't see them. Caleb was very still. "They've been eating bad food for 8 months, she continued. "And bad food isn't just tasteless, it's a message. It says we didn't think you were worth the effort. And that message, Mr. Mercer, that lands deeper than most men will tell you." The silence between them lasted a long time. "So you're saying," Caleb said slowly, "that my ranch hands are leaving because of the cooking. I'm saying your ranch hands are leaving because nobody has made them feel like they're worth staying for," she said. "The cooking is just the most visible part of it." He turned and looked at her fully then. It was a different kind of looking than before, not the assessment of a man deciding whether she was worth his time, but something more direct. Something that made her feel for a moment slightly exposed. "You said that to my foreman today, he asked. "No, sir, your foreman didn't ask. What did Graham say to you?" She met his eyes. "He said I was a stray." Caleb's jaw tightened. The movement was small, but she caught it. "I'm sorry for that," he said, and the particular flatness of it told her it was not a casual apology, that it cost him something to say it, and that he meant it. "I appreciate that," she said. "But I don't need an apology. I need the job." He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at his men, at the table that was for the first time in months actually alive. "You got the job," he said. He went to the table and sat down with his men without another word to her, and Nell turned back to the stove. She allowed herself in the privacy of facing away from the room a single slow breath. She was still here. She had made something worth keeping. But she knew in the particular way you come to know things when you have had to rebuild yourself more than once. That tonight was not a victory. Tonight was a beginning. And beginnings were the easiest part. The hard part was everything that came after. Graham Pike was sitting at the far end of the table. She had not noticed him come in. But he was there when she turned back around, sitting slightly apart from the other men, not talking, not reaching for the biscuits that every other man at that table had already had 2 or 3 of. He was watching her with those small, flat eyes. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second. Then she walked to the table and set a fresh basket of biscuits down directly in front of him. "There's plenty," she said pleasantly. "Don't let them go cold." She walked back to the stove. She could feel his eyes on her back for a long time. She did not turn around. The kitchen fire burned low and steady, and the sound of her men talking, she was already thinking of them that way. She noticed her men filled the room like something coming back to life after a long, cold absence. And Nell Whitaker, who had walked 11 miles with nothing and been pushed into the mud and made herself stand back up, moved through her kitchen with the quiet certainty of a woman who had found the only thing that had always made sense to her. There was work to do here, real work, the kind that mattered. She was just getting started. The next morning began before dawn. That was not unusual for her. She had been waking before the sun her entire life, first because her mother needed help. Then, because the families she cooked for needed breakfast on the table, and eventually, because the silence before the world started up again, was the only time that belonged entirely to her. She had slept in the small room off the kitchen that the previous cook had apparently also used, on a narrow cot with a blanket that wasn't quite warm enough. She had lain awake for a long time listening to the sounds of the ranch settling around her horses moving in the corral. Wind working at the corners of the building, the distant sound of men finishing up night watch. She had thought about Graham Pike. She had thought about the way he'd looked at her at supper. Not with anger exactly, but with something more calculated than anger. Something that watched and waited and measured. She knew men like that. She knew what they did when they felt their territory had been entered without their permission. She knew they didn't come at you directly, not right away. They came sideways. They whispered. They placed small doubts in the right ears. She would have to be careful, but she would also have to be visible. That was the thing she had learned, that the best defense against men who moved in shadows was to stay in the light. To do good work openly, to be seen doing it, to make yourself so clearly useful that the whispers couldn't find any purchase. She got up before 4 in the morning and had coffee on and biscuits in the oven by the time the first shift of men came in from the pre-dawn work at 5:30. The young man with the sunburned neck, she had learned his name, was Thomas. Thomas Reed. 17 years old, and the youngest hand on the ranch, came in first again. He stopped in the doorway exactly the way he had the night before. Ma'am, he said. Thomas, she said. Coffee's hot. He sat down. She brought him a cup and he wrapped both hands around it, and she noticed, looking down, that his knuckles were cracked and bleeding slightly in 3 places. Your hands need looking at, she said. He pulled them back reflexively. They're fine. They're infected in 2 places, or they will be soon. She went to the shelf where she had the night before located a small tin of salve that the previous cook had apparently not known existed. She brought it back and set it on the table in front of him. After you eat. He looked at the tin, looked at her, looked away. Thank you, ma'am, he said very quietly. That was the thing nobody told you about cookwork. Or maybe they told you and you had to find out for yourself that it was true. The food was only ever the beginning of it. Once you had fed someone, once you had given them something real and good, and made with genuine effort, they began to let you see them. The real them. The part that was tired or scared or hurt or lonely. The part they kept tucked away, because on a working ranch there was no room and no language for softness. She learned. Thomas Reed's knuckles were cracked because he was working 2 men's work since another hand had left, and no one had been hired to replace him, and he hadn't said anything because he needed the wages and was afraid if he complained, he'd be let go. She learned over the course of that morning about 4 other men, their names, their situations, the particular burdens they were carrying quietly and alone. And she stored every piece of it. Not to use against them, never that, but because you could not feed someone properly if you did not know what they actually needed. And what they needed was almost never only food. By the time Caleb Mercer came through the kitchen at 7 in the morning, there were 9 men at the table and 3 more who had stopped by already and left for the fields, and the kitchen smelled like coffee and butter and something that he stood in the doorway for a moment trying to identify. What is that smell? He said. Cinnamon, she said. I found half a tin of it at the back of the spice shelf. I added it to the biscuits. She glanced at him. There's coffee. He came in and poured himself a cup and stood at the counter rather than sitting the way men do when they want to stay in a room but keep their options open. 12 men at the breakfast table, he said. 13, she said. Young Tommy Reed just stepped out back. He'll be back in a minute. He looked at her. Last 3 weeks I've been lucky to see 6. She turned back to the stove. That's all you've got to say about it. Mom. I got other things I need to say to you, she said, but I don't think this is the right time. Why not? She glanced at the table. At the men. He understood. He put down his coffee cup and nodded toward the back door. She set down her spoon and followed him out. The morning air was cold and bright, the mountains throwing long shadows across the east side of the ranch. Tell me, he said. Thomas Reed is doing 2 men's work. she said. He's got infected cracks in his hands, and he's too afraid to mention it because he needs the money. He's the youngest hand you've got, and the way he works in 2 years, he'll either be your most valuable employee, or you'll have run him into the ground and he'll leave. It depends on what you do with him now. Caleb was quiet. Pete Hollis, she continued. The tall man with the red beard. He's got a problem with his left knee. He's been compensating for it for months, and it's changed how he moves, and he's starting to hurt his back, trying to protect the knee. He should see a doctor, and if there's no doctor, someone should at least know about it, so he's not assigned work that makes it worse. She stopped. Caleb was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. How do you know all that? He said. You've been here less than 24 hours. People talk when they feel safe, she said. And people feel safe when someone's taken the trouble to feed them properly. He was quiet again. A wind came through and she crossed her arms against it. Is there more? He said. Quite a bit more, she said. But I didn't want to overwhelm you this early in the morning. And there it was again, that small, almost invisible thing at the corner of his mouth. That suggestion of something that might have been a smile. You're going to be trouble, aren't you? He said. She thought about it. Probably, she said. But it'll be the useful kind. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the porch rail and put it back on. I'll talk to Thomas, he said. And I'll get someone to look at Pete's knee. Thank you, she said. He started to walk away. Mr. Mercer, she said. He turned back. Your men are good men, she said. I can already see that. They're just running on empty. And a man running on empty on food, on dignity, on feeling like he matters. She held his gaze. He'll work himself half to death and still walk away. Not because he doesn't care, because he can't remember why he should. Something moved through his face, something old and private. I know, he said. It was a quiet, heavy thing the way he said it, like it wasn't only about his men. She watched him walk away across the yard, and then she went back inside to her kitchen, to her fire, to the work that was waiting for her. The work that was, she was beginning to understand only partly about Biscuits. The days that followed moved fast at Redstone Valley Ranch, the way days always move when real work is finally being done after a long spell of nothing. Nell found her rhythm quickly. Up before 4, fire built coffee on biscuits in the oven before the sky even thought about turning pale. She kept a small notebook in her apron pocket. Not her mother's recipes, those she kept in the tin safe, but a working notebook, the kind she filled with observations. Which men came in favoring their right side? Which men didn't talk at breakfast, but loosened up by supper? Which men ate too fast, the way men eat when they've been hungry long enough that eating fast becomes a habit you can't shake even when the food is good? She was building a picture. And the picture told her things that no ranch ledger ever could. Thomas Reed was at the table every morning at 5:30, without fail, and within 3 days he had stopped pulling his hands back when she looked at them. The salve she'd found had done its work, and his knuckles were healing, and something in him was healing. Along with them. Some tight defensive thing he carried in his shoulders was slowly releasing. He started talking at breakfast. Small things at first. The weather. A horse that had been acting strange. Then bigger things. He was from Missouri originally. His father had died when he was 15. He'd come west because there was nothing left in Missouri that wanted him, and he'd heard there was always work on the Colorado ranches. Do you like it here? Nell asked him one morning, pouring his coffee. He thought about it longer than most people would have. I like it better this week than I did last week, he said. She smiled and didn't push it further. That was the thing about Thomas. He was young enough that honesty still came naturally to him. He hadn't spent enough years learning to perform contentment when he didn't feel it. What he said was what was true, and what was true was that something had shifted for him in the past few days, and he wasn't yet sure what to make of it. Pete Hollis was a different kind of conversation. How was a big man? Pete broad and deliberate in the way he moved, the kind of man who had spent so many years being physically capable that admitting limitation felt close to admitting defeat. When Caleb spoke to him about his knee, Pete had apparently said it was fine. He'd said it the way men say things are fine when they are absolutely not fine, and they'd like everyone to stop looking at them. Nell waited until the kitchen was empty one evening. The supper hour over, the other men drifted back to the bunkhouse, and Pete lingered at the table, the way she'd noticed he sometimes did not quite ready to make the walk across the yard with that knee throbbing. She poured him a second cup of coffee without asking. She sat down across from him. "Don't," he said before she could speak. "I haven't said anything yet." "You've got a look," he said. "A certain look that means you're about to say something I don't want to hear. How's the knee tonight?" He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "I've had worse." "That's not the same as fine." He looked at her. He had brown eyes, Pete warm and weathered, and behind the stubbornness in them was something tired and a little frightened. "I need this job," he said. "I know you do. If Mercer thinks I can't pull my weight—" "Mr. Mercer already knows about your knee," she said, "and he hasn't let you go, so that argument doesn't hold." Pete was quiet. "He knows," he said finally. "He knows." The silence sat between them. "Then why hasn't he said anything to me directly?" Pete said. "Because he's still figuring out how to be the kind of man who does," Nell said. It came out before she entirely thought about it, and she wondered for a half-second if she'd overstepped. But Pete looked at her with something that wasn't quite surprise, more like recognition. Like she'd put words to something he'd already suspected. "Yeah," Pete said. "I reckon that's about right." She talked to him for another 20 minutes. About the knee. About what work could be shifted without it looking like charity. About how to be honest with a man you respected about something that felt shameful when you were the kind of man whose whole life was physical work. When he stood to leave, he did it carefully, the way he always did, but there was something different in his face. "Miss Whitaker," he said at the door. She looked up. "Thank you for the coffee," he said. Both cups. She understood perfectly well that he wasn't talking about the coffee. It was on the fourth day that Graham Pike made his first move. She had been expecting it. The waiting was in its own way worse than whatever he was going to do, the way the air changes before a storm, that particular held-breath quality to everything. She caught him watching her twice that day from across the yard, and both times when she looked up, he didn't look away. He just kept watching her, steady and flat-eyed. The move, when it came, was small. Precisely small, the way Graham Pike did everything. She came into this kitchen at noon to start on the midday meal and found that the flour sack she'd organized on the second shelf, the large one nearly full that she'd mentally allocated for the next 3 days of baking, was gone. In its place was a smaller, inferior sack, the kind of flour she'd already assessed as being damp-stored and clumping. It was a small thing. Most people wouldn't have noticed. She stood in front of that shelf for 10 seconds, completely still, and felt the particular cold clarity that came over her when she recognized a threat. Then she went to find the ranch hand who managed supply storage. His name was Joe Drummond, a quiet man in his 40s who managed the supply barn with the careful efficiency of someone who genuinely loved order. She found him organizing fence supplies in the back of the barn. "Joe," she said, "do you know what happened to the large flour sack I had on the kitchen shelf?" Joe went very still, in the way people go still when they've been put in an impossible position. "Mr. Pike asked me to move it," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Said the kitchen didn't need that much at once. Said it was wasteful to keep large stores in the kitchen." "I see," Nell said. "Miss Whitaker, Joe started. "It's all right, Joe," she said. "You were following an instruction from your foreman. That's your job." She went directly from the supply barn to the main house. She knocked on the door of Caleb Mercer's office. "Come in," he said. She came in and closed the door behind her and stood in front of his desk and told him plainly and quickly exactly what had happened. She did not editorialize. She did not assign motive. She stated facts. The flour had been moved. Graham Pike had ordered it moved. The flour that replaced it was inferior and would affect the quality of the baking. Caleb listened without expression. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Is there anything else you need to tell me?" he said. "Not at this moment," she said. He stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the yard. "I'll handle it," he said. "That's all I needed to hear," she said. She turned to leave. "Nell!" It was the first time he'd used her first name. She turned back. He was still looking out the window. "It won't be the last time. You understand that?" "Yes, sir," she said. "I do." "Are you—" He stopped. "Do you want to?" He stopped again. She waited. "Are you going to be all right?" he said finally. And the way he said it, she understood that he was asking something more than the obvious question. He was asking whether she was the kind of person who could handle a sustained campaign from a man who knew this ranch and its systems infinitely better than she did, and whether she was going to stay. "I'm going to be fine," she said, "as long as I know where I stand." He finally turned from the window and looked at her. "You stand here," he said. "You've got my word on that." She nodded once. She went back to the kitchen and made the best possible meal she could with the inferior flour, and it was still better than anything that kitchen had produced in months. That evening the flour sack was back on the shelf where she'd put it. Graham Pike sat at supper and ate 2 biscuits without comment. But she felt his eyes on her across the table, and what was in them was no longer surprise at her stubbornness. It was something harder. Something that had decided to take this seriously. Good, she thought. She preferred a known threat to an unknown one. What she could see, she could prepare for. By the end of the first week, something had changed on the ranch that Nell couldn't have pointed to in any single moment, but could feel in the aggregate of all the small moments put together. There was a different quality to the mornings. Men came to breakfast with more conversation in them. There was less of the hunched, closed-off posture she'd noticed in those first days. Men sitting straighter, making eye contact, actually eating, instead of just putting food in their mouths mechanically and leaving. Small things. Easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. She was always paying attention. On the 8th day, a man named Curtis Webb sat down across from her while she was peeling potatoes in the late afternoon, a time when the kitchen was usually empty, and said without preamble, "I was going to leave." She kept peeling. "When?" she said. "Next Friday," he said. "Had my things already half packed. Talked to a man at Miller's Crossing who said there was work up north." "What changed?" she asked. He thought about it. He was a serious man, Curtis mid-30s, not given to long speeches. "The biscuits," he said. And then after a pause, "No, not the biscuits. He stopped. "The fact that someone took the trouble." She looked up. "Someone took the trouble to make something good," he said. "When they didn't have to. When we weren't—" He stopped again. "We weren't in a position to demand it. Nobody was going to fire anybody over bad food. But you took the trouble anyway." He looked at his hands. "I reckon that means something," he said. She didn't say anything. She just nodded and kept peeling potatoes because she knew that was what he needed. Not a speech, not acknowledgement, just the quiet companionship of someone who had heard him. "Anyway," he said and stood up. "Thought you should know." He walked out. She peeled potatoes for another minute after he left, and then she put down the peeler and pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment and breathed. Then she picked the peeler back up. Work to do. It was on the 10th day that Caleb Mercer did something that surprised her. She was in the kitchen at her usual post. After supper, cleaning up the last of the dishes, when she heard his footsteps, and then the creak of the kitchen door, and then nothing, which meant he'd stopped in the doorway rather than coming in. "You should sit down," he said. She turned and looked at him. "I've been sitting down all day," she said. "Upright sitting in the saddle. You should sit down." He came in and sat at the kitchen table. She poured him coffee without asking the way she poured coffee for everyone who sat at that table, because it was her philosophy that a cup of coffee in someone's hand was the fastest way to get them to stay long enough to say what they'd actually come to say. He wrapped his hands around the cup. She leaned against the counter. "Tell me something," he said. "All right. Why are you here?" he said. "Not at the ranch. Why here? Colorado. Why not somewhere else? A city. Women with your—" He paused. "With your way of understanding people, they go somewhere that rewards it." She considered the question. "I had a life in Denver for a while," she said. "Working in a household. Good family. I thought it was going to be a long arrangement." "What happened?" She looked at the window. Outside, the dark was complete. The man of the house decided I was something other than what I am, she said. His wife believed him instead of me. I was dismissed without reference and advised to leave the city. Caleb's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went very still. "I'm sorry," he said. And this time, it was even quieter than the first time he'd said it to her out in the yard. "I didn't tell you that for sympathy," she said. "I told you so you understand why I'm not in a city. Some doors close permanently. You find the open ones, and you walk through them. Even if the open door is a ranch in Colorado, where the foreman throws you in the mud." "Especially then," she said. "Because at least I knew standing in that mud that nobody here was pretending to be something they weren't." He looked at her. "I was pretending," he said. "When you came to the gate, I was pretending that I didn't need help, that the ranch was fine, that I had everything managed." She waited. "It isn't fine," he said. "It hasn't been fine for a long time. I've been losing money for 2 seasons. Losing men. I had—" He stopped, set down the coffee cup. "I had a partner, in the early years, man named Robert Aldous. He ran the business side. I ran the cattle. Between us it worked." He was quiet. "He died 2 years ago. Fever. And since then I've been trying to run both halves of this thing alone, and I—" He stopped again. She understood he was not a man who said things like this easily. Who said I failed, or I couldn't manage it, or I needed someone, and I didn't ask. She understood that whatever had brought him to this kitchen, to this table, to this conversation, had taken something from him that she shouldn't treat carelessly. "It makes sense," she said, "that you're struggling. One person doing 2 people's work always breaks down eventually. It's not a character flaw. It's just math." He looked at her with something she recognized from Pete Hollis's face, in this same kitchen, in this same low light. Relief. The specific relief of being told that a thing you've been ashamed of is actually just a simple human understandable fact. "It's just math," he said. "Yes, sir." He sat there for another moment. Then he picked up the coffee cup again and finished it. "Your biscuits are the best I've ever had," he said, and his voice was back to its ordinary register, not the quiet, stripped-down thing it had been a moment ago. Back to the surface. But she understood that was all right. Men needed to come back to the surface. That was the other thing nobody told you about this kind of work. "My mother's recipe," she said. "Your mother was a remarkable woman. She was the hardest working person I have ever known," Nell said, "and the wisest, and she died with nothing to show for it except those recipe cards and a daughter who paid attention." Caleb set down the cup. "That's not nothing," he said. She looked at him. "No," she said after a moment. "I reckon it's not." He stood up. He picked up his hat from the table. "Good night, Nell," he said. "Good night, Mr. Mercer." He paused at the door. "Caleb," he said, if you're going to be here, you might as well call me by my name." She considered it. "Good night, Caleb," she said. He nodded once and walked out. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment after he left, listening to his footsteps cross the yard, and then she turned and looked at her mother's recipe tin sitting on the shelf. "Don't say a word," she told it. But she was smiling. That was the night Graham Pike began the second phase. She didn't know it then. She found out later in the piecemeal way you find out things on a ranch in fragments from different people, none of whom realized they were each giving her a piece of the same picture. What Graham did was simple. He started talking, not loudly, not in ways that could be traced back to him easily. He talked to men in the barn, men and on night watch, men passing through the yard. He didn't say anything obviously damaging. He was too careful for that. What he said was smaller. He said things like, "Isn't it interesting how quick Mercer started listening to someone who's only been here 2 weeks?" He said, "I'm not saying anything against her cooking, but a ranch isn't a kitchen." He said, "A man ought to be careful about who he takes counsel from, especially someone who just showed up out of nowhere and nobody knows the first thing about. Seeds. Small, precise seeds planted in the particular soil of men who were proud and who did not want to think they were being managed." Nell found out about it from Thomas Reed. Thomas was too young to know how to be subtle about it. He came to her on the 11th morning with his jaw set and his eyes troubled, and he told her directly and without embellishment what he'd heard Graham saying in the barn the night before. He said, "Thomas told her that you had Mercer wrapped around your finger, and that it wasn't proper, and that men who'd been here for years were losing authority to someone who'd been here 10 minutes. Did he say that in those words?" she asked. "Close enough," Thomas said. She thought about it. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "What are you going to do?" he said. She looked at him, this 17-year-old boy with the healing knuckles and the two serious eyes. "I'm going to make breakfast," she said. "And then I'm going to make lunch. And then I'm going to make supper. And I'm going to do that every day, and do it better than the day before, and let people draw their own conclusions." Thomas looked unsatisfied with this answer. "He's trying to run you off," he said. "I know. Doesn't that make you angry?" She set down the bowl she was holding and looked at him properly. "Thomas," she said, "I have been underestimated by better men than Graham Pike. I have been lied about and dismissed and pushed into the mud in front of 20 people and told I had no place here. And every single time I have gotten up and done the work." She picked the bowl back up. "That is my answer to Graham Pike, the work." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he rolled up his sleeves and said, "Can I help with breakfast?" She handed him the spoon. The twist came on the 14th day, and it hit her like cold water. She had been reorganizing the supply records. Caleb had asked her to look at the inventory system, because it was a mess, and she had a gift for order, and she was working through the ledger when she found the first anomaly. A supply of salt pork, ordered and paid for. But the quantity delivered according to the delivery log was significantly less than what had been ordered and billed. She stared at the numbers. She checked them again. Then she pulled the previous month. The same pattern. Not identical numbers, but the same shape of it. Orders for one quantity, deliveries of another, and the difference. She added it up slowly, carefully, making sure she wasn't misreading the difference, added up to a sum that was not insignificant. She sat very still. She thought about this kitchen she had walked into 2 weeks ago. The poorly stocked shelves. The insufficient supplies. The inferior ingredients that explained the terrible food, that explained the men feeling worthless, that explained the men leaving. And she thought about who managed the supply orders. Who had always managed the supply orders. She closed the ledger. She held it against her chest and sat in the supply room for 10 minutes by herself, thinking about what she was going to do with what she now knew. Because knowing something like this was not a simple thing. It was a weight. And the way you put it down mattered as much as the fact that you had picked it up. She could be wrong. She was not an accountant. Numbers could be misread. But she did not think she was wrong. And if she was right, then Graham Pike was not just a threatened man protecting his territory. He was stealing from Caleb Mercer. He had been stealing, by her rough calculation, for at least 2 months. She took the ledger to Caleb that same afternoon. She knocked on the office door, and when he said, "Come in," she walked to his desk and put the ledger in front of him without preamble and pointed to the numbers and said, "I need you to look at this and tell me whether I'm reading it correctly or whether I've made a mistake." He looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. The silence in the room changed quality the way silence does when the person inside it is recalculating something fundamental. "Where did you find this?" he said. "The supply room. You asked me to organize the records." He looked at the previous month's page. He sat back in his chair and pressed his hand over his mouth. "How long?" he said. "I can only be certain about 2 months," she said. "To look further back, I'd need to go through older records. I can do that if you want." "Graham handles all supply orders," Caleb said. Not to her, almost to himself. "He has for 5 years." She waited. 5 years, he said again, and she heard something in it that was not just the weight of money lost. It was the weight of trust betrayed. A man he'd given responsibility to. A man he'd relied on. A man who had stood in the yard and called Nell astray and pushed her into the mud, while simultaneously systematically stealing from the man he worked for. "Caleb," she said quietly. "I could be wrong. The discrepancies could have another explanation. I am not accusing anyone." He looked at her. "No," he said. You're not wrong. His voice was flat. I've noticed supply shortfalls for months. I thought it was waste. I thought it was poor management. I never... He stopped. She understood. He had never suspected Graham because he had trusted Graham, and trust is the one blind spot that the most otherwise observant man will have about the people he has chosen to believe in. "What do you need from me?" she said. He looked up. "Nothing," he said. "You've already done what I needed." He looked at the ledger. "I'll handle the rest." She nodded and stood to leave. "Nell," he said, and she turned back. His face was something she hadn't seen from him before. Something without the careful composure he usually maintained. Something raw and tired, and underneath it grateful in a way that seemed to go somewhere deeper than the supply ledger. "Thank you," he said. "I was just organizing records," she said. "No," he said. "You were doing what someone should have been doing for a long time, looking closely enough to see what was actually there." She held his gaze for a moment. "That's what I do," she said. "It's what I've always done." She walked back to her kitchen. She built up the fire. She started on supper. Outside, she could hear the ranch going about its afternoon workmen crossing the yard horses in the corral, the distant sound of cattle. She sliced the salt pork thin the way the men liked it. She measured out the flour for tomorrow's biscuits. She kept her hands busy and her mind quiet, because the quiet was the thing she needed right now. What was coming next, she could feel it the way she'd felt 100 things before the particular atmospheric pressure of consequence building. Before it breaks, what was coming next was not going to be quiet. She had handed Caleb Mercer the proof of something that was going to change the shape of his ranch and his trust and his understanding of someone he had relied on for 5 years. And Graham Pike, who watched everything and missed nothing, was going to feel that ground shifting under him. And when a cornered man felt the ground shifting, he didn't sit still. She knew that. She kept cooking. She was ready. Graham Pike found out the same night. Nell didn't know how. She didn't know whether Caleb had confronted him directly, or whether one of the men had let something slip, or whether Graham simply had the instincts of a man who had spent years watching for the moment his luck would run out. But she knew he found out, because at supper that evening, he didn't come to the table at all, and Graham Pike had never missed a meal since she'd been at Redstone Valley Ranch. His absence was louder than anything he could have said. Thomas noticed it first. He leaned across the table toward Curtis Webb and said something low, and Curtis looked at the empty seat, and then looked at Nell, and she gave him nothing back, just ladled beans onto the next man's plate and kept moving. But inside, she was counting. A man like Graham didn't disappear quietly. He regrouped. He made calculations. He decided what he had left to lose and what he was willing to do about it. She had handed Caleb the ledger that afternoon. That meant Graham had maybe 12 hours, maybe less, before Caleb moved on it formally. And a man who knew that kind of clock was running did not spend those hours sitting in his bunkhouse staring at the ceiling. He spent them doing damage. She found out what damage at 4:15 the next morning when she came into the kitchen and found it. The flour. All of it. Not moved this time. Ruined. The large sack she'd been protecting since Graham's first move had been opened, and water had been poured into it. Not enough to be obvious at a glance, but enough that when she plunged her hand into it, she felt the clumping immediately. The buttermilk, both jugs from the cold cellar, had been left out overnight. The salt pork she'd prepared for the morning was gone entirely. She stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at what remained. She had 2 hours before the men came in for breakfast. 23 men, a full morning's work ahead of them, and a kitchen that had just been gutted. She did not panic. Panic was a luxury she had never been able to afford. She moved to the shelves and took inventory of what was untouched. Cornmeal. Dried beans from the cold cellar. Eggs, there were eggs. Lard that was still good. A portion of smoked ham at the back of the cold cellar that Graham apparently hadn't found or hadn't bothered with. She started the fire. She boiled water. She worked. She made cornbread instead of biscuits. She fried the ham thin and stretched it with the eggs. She brewed the coffee strong enough to compensate for everything else. When Thomas Reed came through the door at 5:30, she was plating the first round. He looked at the table, looked at her. "No biscuits," he said. Not today, she said. Sit down. He sat. He ate. He was quiet for a moment. What happened? He said. Nothing I can't manage, she said. He looked at her with those young, too serious eyes, and she understood that he already knew or suspected, and was giving her the choice of whether to confirm it. Eat your breakfast, Thomas, she said. He ate. But he didn't leave when he was done. He stayed at the table until the other men filtered in, and she noticed that he positioned himself near the door, the way a person positions himself when he's decided he's staying close to something he wants to protect. She pretended not to notice. Caleb came in at 7. He stopped inside the door. He looked at the table, at the cornbread and ham and eggs, at the absence of what was always there. He looked at her. She tilted her head very slightly toward the back door. He followed her out. She told him quickly and without decoration what she had found that morning. The ruined flour, the buttermilk, the missing pork. He went very still. He knew, Caleb said. Yes. He knew I'd seen the ledger. He knew something had shifted, she said. Whether he knew the specific detail I can't say. But men like Graham Pike don't wait to find out how much trouble they're in. They move first. Caleb's jaw was tight. She could see it from here. Where is he now? She said. Bunkhouse, far as I know. I was going to speak to him this morning. He stopped. I should have done it last night. You were being careful, she said. Ed, there's nothing wrong with that. He sabotaged my kitchen. Yes. He ruined food that my men needed. The particular quiet in those words was different from anger. It was something colder and more deliberate. She had noticed before that Caleb Mercer did not raise his voice when he was genuinely furious. He got quieter. Like all the heat was being compressed down to a single concentrated point. I'll handle the breakfast, she said. You handle Graham. He looked at her. I'm sorry this happened, he said. Don't be sorry, she said. Just make it not happen again. He nodded once, turned, and walked with that quiet, deliberate stride toward the bunkhouse. She went back inside and refilled the coffee. She didn't hear the conversation. She didn't ask about it afterward, and Caleb didn't offer the details, which she respected. What happened between a man and an employee he was confronting about theft was not her business unless she was made a part of it. What she knew was that Graham Pike came through the yard 20 minutes later carrying a bag, and he did not look at the kitchen as he passed, and he did not look back when he reached the gate. He was gone before 8 in the morning. The silence he left behind was complicated. She felt it in the kitchen, in the slight difference in the men's posture when they came in for the midday meal. It wasn't relief exactly. It was something more unsettled, like the ground had moved under everyone's feet, and they were still finding their balance. Curtis Webb was the one who said it out loud. Graham's gone, he said, sitting down at the table with his hat in his hands. Not a question. I heard, Nell said. He been here 5 years, Curtis said. I know. She set a plate in front of him. He looked at it without eating. I didn't like the man, Curtis said. But 5 years is a long time. Makes you think. What does it make you think? She said. He was quiet for a moment. Makes me think about how long a person can be in a place and still be doing wrong by it, he said. And nobody sees it. She sat down across from him. She did something she rarely did in the middle of service. She gave him her full-stopped attention. People see what they trust, she said. Caleb trusted Graham because Graham had earned it back when he was earning it honestly. Trust doesn't update itself automatically. Someone has to look at the numbers. You looked at the numbers, Curtis said. I was asked to organize records. I just looked closely. Curtis was quiet. You always look closely, he said. Not an accusation, more like something he was working out. It's the only way I know how to do anything, she said. He picked up his fork. Good, he said. We need someone around here who does. The day after Graham left should have been easier. And in some ways, it was the particular tension of knowing he was watching. Measuring planning was gone, and that was a physical thing. She hadn't entirely realized she'd been carrying until it wasn't there anymore. But a ranch doesn't simplify just because one complicated thing is removed. The work was still the work. The men were still 23 individuals, with 23 sets of needs and histories and quiet struggles. The supplies still needed reorganizing. Caleb still needed someone to look at the inventory ledger and tell him how bad the shortfall actually was. She did that on the 16th day after supper, sitting at the kitchen table with the ledger spread out in front of her, and Caleb across from her with a coffee cup and his hat off. It took 2 hours. The number at the end of it was not good. She wrote it on a piece of paper and pushed it across the table to him. He looked at it. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "That's 2 seasons," he said. "Yes. That's..." He stopped. "That's not recoverable this year." "Not fully," she said. "But partly. And partly is better than you were at this time yesterday, because this time yesterday you didn't know the real number. You were working from a false picture." He looked up. "A false picture is easier," he said. "No," she said. "It just feels easier. It's actually much harder because you're trying to navigate by something that doesn't correspond to the real terrain." He held her gaze. "Where did you learn to think like this?" he said. "From a life that didn't leave me much room for illusions," she said. He looked down at the number on the paper. Then he folded the paper deliberately and put it in his shirt pocket. "All right," he said. "Tell me what you think I should do." She hadn't expected that. The directness of it. She had expected him to take the information and withdraw to process it alone, the way he seemed to process most things. "You want my opinion?" she said. "I want your honest assessment," he said, "which I've found is more reliable than most people's careful opinions." She thought about it. "You cut costs where you can, without cutting quality on the things that matter most," she said. "The food stays good. You can negotiate better on everything else if your men are loyal, and they're loyal when they feel valued. You also need to replace the foreman position, but not immediately. Run without one for a month. See what each man can do when the middle layer is gone. You might find you have more capacity than you thought." He listened. "And the debt," he said. "You make it manageable," she said. "A piece at a time, the same way you do everything that looks impossible." "Which is how?" "You start with what's in front of you," she said. "And you don't look at the whole thing all at once, because the whole thing will paralyze you. You look at what you can do today." He was quiet. "You sound like you've done this before," he said. "I've rebuilt my life from nothing 3 times, she said. "Each time I looked at the whole thing, I couldn't move. Each time I looked at the next one thing, I could." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "You can have full authority over the kitchen accounts, supplies, ordering, allocation. I want you to run it completely." She looked at him. "That's a significant decision," she said. "It's the right one." "You barely know me." "I know enough," he said. And then carefully, "I know you could have used what you found in that ledger to put yourself in a better position. You could have held it, used it as leverage. That's what most people would have done." "I'm not most people," she said. "No," he said. "You're not." She accepted the responsibility. She shook his hand across the kitchen table, which was not how these things were usually done, and she saw that catch him slightly off guard, and then he gripped her hand firmly and shook it. "We'll sort out the wages too," he said. "What you're doing is worth more than we agreed on." "We can talk about that later," she said. "One thing at a time." He almost smiled. "One thing at a time," he agreed. It was 3 days later that the weather changed. She felt it before she could see any evidence of it, that particular shift in the air that her mother had always called the sky drawing breath. A drop in temperature that wasn't the ordinary kind. A stillness that was too complete. She was in the kitchen when it happened. She stopped what she was doing and stood very still and listened. "Thomas," she said. Thomas was at the table behind her, shelling beans for her because he had started doing that, showing up in the kitchen and finding things to help with, without being asked, without fanfare. "Ma'am," he said, "go find Mr. Mercer, right now." Something in her voice moved him without question. He was out the door in seconds. Caleb came in 4 minutes later. "Something's coming," she said. I didn't dismiss it. He went to the door and looked out, and she watched his face, and she saw the moment he felt what she had felt. "How long do you think?" he said. "I don't know," she said. "But we need to move the livestock now, not when we can see it coming. And we need to get men back in from the far fields." Howe was already moving. He went out, and she heard him calling across the yard, his voice carrying with the particular snap of authority that men respond to immediately when they've learned to trust it. She turned back to her kitchen. This was her part. She thought fast and practically. A storm bad enough to feel like this in the air was not an overnight problem. It was a days-long problem, which meant men working in brutal conditions who needed to come back to something that would keep them functional. Which meant food that held heat, that could be made in large quantities, that could be kept warm for hours without losing its sustaining quality. Which meant she needed to start cooking now before the storm hit and keep cooking through it. She took complete stock of everything she had. She calculated quantities. She thought about the men who would be coming in cold and exhausted, the ones who'd be working the night shifts, the ones who might not come in from the field for hours after the worst of it hit. She made a list. Then she went to the supply barn herself, because she was no longer waiting for anyone to manage supplies for her, and she pulled what she needed. By the time the first clouds were visible on the horizon, her kitchen was producing at full capacity. She had a cauldron of thick stew on one side of the stove, biscuits going in the oven in rotation, a pot of beans, coffee that she planned to keep hot continuously for as long as the storm lasted. She had moved the cold cellar supplies up into the kitchen, where she could access them without going outside, and she had organized everything with the particular methodical efficiency of someone who understood that in a crisis, the first casualty was always good organization, and you had to build the structure before the chaos arrived. Thomas was with her for 2 hours, doing whatever she asked, before Caleb pulled him to help with the livestock. Joe Drummond appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Miss Whitaker," he said, "you need anything from the barn?" "I need 2 more men in here to help carry," she said. He went and got them. The storm arrived at dusk, and it arrived hard. She heard it before it hit, a sound like the world taking a deep breath and then releasing everything at once. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in under an hour. The wind came from the north, and it came with fury, and it hit the ranch house walls with a force that she felt through the floor under her feet. The kitchen became the center of the ranch. Men came in from the storm faces, red and rigid, from the cold hands shaking too exhausted even to speak, and she put food in front of them and coffee in their hands. And she watched life come back into them the way she'd watched it happen on the first night, except now it wasn't just warmth and good food. Now it was survival. She did not stop moving. For 11 hours straight, she did not sit down. She cooked and she served, and she kept track of who had come in and who hadn't. And when Pete Hollis appeared at 2 in the morning with blood on his face from a fall and his knee so swollen he could barely walk, she got him to the kitchen table and cleaned the cut herself and wrapped his knee with strips of cloth from the supply closet and sent him to the back room with 2 blankets and orders not to move. "I need to go back out," he said. "Your knee is 3 times its normal size," she said. "You'll do more harm than good out there. There are still men working. And they need you functional tomorrow," she said. "Which you won't be if you go back out there tonight and do permanent damage to that joint. Sit down." He sat down. He looked at her with an expression that was equal parts frustration and the reluctant, bone-deep relief of a man who has been given permission to stop. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Don't thank me," she said. "I'm being entirely practical." But she squeezed his shoulder once quickly as she passed him, and she felt him exhale. Caleb came in at 3 in the morning. She had not seen him since the storm hit. She had heard his voice periodically across the yard directions to men, decisions made and acted on with the efficiency of someone who had run a cattle ranch long enough that crisis management was simply a different kind of workday. But she hadn't seen him. When he came through the kitchen door, she turned from the stove and stopped. He was soaked through. His hat was gone. There was ice in his hair, actual ice, and his hands, when he came close to the stove, were shaking slightly with the fine tremor of extreme cold. She poured coffee immediately and pressed the cup into his hands. He wrapped both hands around it the way she had seen him do before, but this time there was nothing controlled about it. He just needed the warmth. She put a bowl of stew in front of him. "Sit," she said. He sat, which told her more about how exhausted he was than anything else could have. Caleb Mercer did not take directions from anyone. The fact that he sat when she told him to without question meant his body had reached a point where it was simply responding to whoever had a warm bowl and a steady voice. "How many men are still out?" she said. "3," he said. "Curtis and 2 others. They're with the cattle in the north barn. They'll stay there until morning." "Are they all right?" "Cold and miserable," he said. "Yeah." "I'll pack food to send out at first light," she said. He looked up. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. He held her gaze. "You've been at that stove for how long?" he said. "Long enough." "Nell?" "I stopped counting hours a while ago," she said. It didn't seem useful. He looked at the stew in front of him. He looked at the kitchen, at the organized, still functioning kitchen, the fire still burning the supply of food that she had calculated and managed so that there was still enough for morning. "When I came in tonight," he said slowly, "my men they were okay. Not just alive. They had something left. You understand what I mean? They'd been fed," she said. "Properly. Continuously. More than that," he said. "They'd had someone looking out for them. Someone who—" He stopped. "When I was out there with the cattle, and it was bad, the worst of it, what I kept thinking was, I knew you were in here. I knew this was—" He stopped again. She waited. "I knew this was holding," he said. "And I could focus on what I needed to do out there because I knew this was holding." She didn't say anything for a moment. "That's what I'm here for," she said quietly. "It's more than that," he said. "Don't oversimplify it in the other direction either," she said, though gently. "I cook. I pay attention. I'm organized. Those are practical skills." "You kept 12 men from breaking tonight," he said. "On practical skills." She met his eyes. "Caleb," she said, "eat your stew before it gets cold." He almost laughed. It was a rough, exhausted sound, barely there but real. He ate. She kept the fire. And it was somewhere in those hours, the storm still raging outside the kitchen, burning steady and warm. Caleb Mercer, eating stew at her table in the middle of the worst night the ranch had seen in years, that something shifted between them in a way that neither of them named. But they both felt it. At 4:30, with the worst of the storm beginning to thin, a sound came from outside that was wrong. Not wind, not cattle. A voice. She heard it before Caleb did, higher, more urgent than the ambient noise of the storm. She crossed this kitchen and opened the back door, and the cold hit her like a wall, and she heard it clearly. Someone was shouting. Caleb was already behind her. He pushed past her into the yard, and she heard him shout back. Heard a voice answer, and then 2 figures materialized out of the dark and the wind. Not the men from the north barn. Different men. Men she recognized as part of the fence line crew. One of them was carrying the other. The one being carried wasn't moving. "Get him inside," Caleb said, and his voice was that cold, compressed thing again. Command stripped of everything except necessity. They brought him in. She cleared the kitchen table with one sweep of her arm, and they laid him on it. His name was Danny Cross. He was 22. He had been caught in the open when the worst of the storm hit, and had been walking for 2 hours before his partner found him. I was not unconscious. But he was close. She knew cold. She knew what the body looked like when it had been pushed to its outer limit, and what it needed in the next 10 minutes to pull back from that edge. "Blankets," she said to Thomas, who had reappeared in the kitchen door. "Everything in the supply closet." To Caleb, "I need the fire built up higher." To Danny's partner, "What's his name?" "Danny," he said. "Danny Cross." She leaned over Danny Cross. "Danny," she said, clear, firm. "Danny, you're inside. You're at the ranch. Can you hear me?" A movement. The smallest thing. His eyes trying to focus. "That's right," she said. "Stay with me." She worked. Blankets heat the cup of broth she'd been keeping warm, given in small amounts, carefully checking his response each time. She talked to him the whole time, not soothing, not anxious, just steady. Steady and present the way her mother had talked to her through bad fevers when she was a child. Just a voice continuous and calm, reminding the body that there was still a reason to come back. Caleb stood at the edge of the kitchen and watched her. She didn't look at him. She was focused entirely on Danny Cross. 20 minutes later, Danny was talking. Slowly with effort, and what he said was mostly confused, but he was talking, which meant he was coming back, which meant they were going to be all right. She sat back in her chair and let out a slow breath. The kitchen was very quiet, except for the sound of the fire and the still present wind outside. "Will he be okay?" Thomas said. "He needs to sleep and stay warm," she said. "And he needs to be watched for the next few hours." She looked at Thomas. "Can you do that? Stay with him?" "Yes, ma'am," Thomas said, without hesitation. She stood up. She was shaking. She realized it only when she tried to pour herself coffee, and her hand was not quite steady. She set the pot down and pressed both hands flat on the counter and breathed. Caleb was beside her. He didn't touch her. He just stood close. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine." "Nell, sit down." She sat down. He poured the coffee himself and set it in front of her, and then he sat across from her, and for a long time, neither of them said anything. The storm outside was quieting. Somewhere in the east, though you couldn't see it yet, the sky was beginning to turn. "He would have died," Caleb said. Not loud, just a fact. "He would have been very close to it," she said. "If you hadn't—" He stopped. "If you hadn't had the broth ready. If the kitchen hadn't been—" He looked at her. "If you hadn't been here." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "But I was here," she said. Caleb looked at her with something she was only beginning to know how to read, this man who kept so much behind a composed surface, who had spent years alone with the weight of everything he carried, who had trusted the wrong person for 5 years and lost more than just money to that trust. He looked at her like she was something solid, something that had been there when he needed it and had not moved. "Yes," he said. "You were here." She didn't say what she was thinking, which was that she had almost not been here, that the gate had been closed in her face, that she had been called a stray and pushed into the mud and told she had no place among hardworking men. She didn't say it. It didn't need saying. "Caleb," she said instead, "when the storm clears and things settle, I need to talk to you about Danny Cross's situation. He has no family here, and he's been living on wages that don't leave room for any kind of hardship. If he needs time to recover, he needs to know it won't cost him his position." Caleb looked at her. "Consider it done," he said. "And Thomas Reed," she said. "He's been doing the work of someone much older than he is, and he's never complained once. He deserves recognition for that. Not a speech, something practical. I'll see to it." "And Pete Hollis's knee." "Nell," he said. She stopped. "I will see to all of it," he said. "I hear you." She nodded. Outside, the wind was dying. Dawn was coming. The ranch had survived the night, not because of any single thing, not because of the cattle or the fences or the decisions made in the field. All of those things mattered. But what had held it together, the true center of it, the thing that had kept 23 men fed and warm and fighting and alive, had been this kitchen, had been her. She picked up her coffee cup. The fire crackled. Thomas sat quietly beside Danny Cross, watching the rise and fall of his breathing. And Caleb Mercer sat across from her and looked at her with the particular expression of a man who is, for the first time in a very long time, not sitting alone. The morning after the storm was the quietest Nell had ever heard the ranch. Not empty quiet, full quiet. The kind that comes after something hard has passed and everyone is still taking stock of what remains. Men moved through the yard slowly, with the careful deliberateness of people checking their own bodies after a fall, testing weight on each leg before committing to the next step. She had been up since before dawn again. The kitchen was running. Coffee, biscuits, a pot of oatmeal with the last of the dried apples, because the men needed something sweet after a night like that, and she had been saving those apples for exactly this kind of moment without consciously deciding to. Danny Cross was awake. Still pale, still moving slowly, but awake, and sitting up on his own, which was the only thing that mattered. Thomas Reed had not left his side. When she brought Danny a bowl of oatmeal at 6 in the morning, He looked at her with eyes that were clear enough to be embarrassed. "I heard you kept talking to me," he said. "Last night, when it was bad." "I did," she said. I don't remember most of it," he said. "But I remember the voice." He looked at the bowl in his hands. "I remember thinking there was someone there." "There was," she said. "There always will be." She said it simply without weight, the way you say things that are just true, and she watched something move through his face that was too raw for a 22-year-old man to know what to do with. So he just looked back down at his oatmeal and nodded. Thomas looked at her over Danny's head. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. Caleb came in at 7, which was later than his usual time, and she understood that he had stayed in the field until the last possible moment, checking, confirming, accounting for every animal and every piece of equipment the storm had touched. It was the kind of thing he did. The kind of thoroughness that she was learning was simply the way he was built. He looked more rested than she expected, given that she knew he hadn't slept. Some men carried exhaustion in their faces, and some carried it deeper, and Caleb was the second kind. He sat at the table. He looked at Danny Cross. "How are you feeling?" he said. "Better, sir," Danny said. "I'm sorry about last night. I should have gotten back sooner." "You got caught in something nobody predicted," Caleb said. "That's not an apology situation." Danny looked slightly undone by this. Apparently, he'd been bracing for a different kind of conversation. "Your job is here when you're ready to come back to it," Caleb said. "Take the time you need." He looked at Nell very briefly, just a flicker before looking back at Danny. "Miss Whitaker will make sure you're fed properly until you're back on your feet." "Yes, sir," Danny said. "Thank you, sir." Caleb picked up the coffee she'd set in front of him and drank. She moved back to the stove and gave him the privacy of the table, because she understood that he sometimes needed the kitchen without her. Watching him, needed to just be in it, in the warmth of it, the function of it, without having to be performing anything for anyone. She heard him talking to some of the men as they came in. Quiet exchanges, brief the way he talked when he was in work mode. But there was something different in the texture of it this morning. A slight loosening that she couldn't point to in any specific word or phrase. She thought about what he'd said the night before. "I knew this was holding." She thought about that a lot over the next few days. What it meant to be the thing that held. Not the hero. Not the person making the big decisions under pressure. Just the constant, reliable, unglamorous center that everything else could depend on. She had been that thing her whole life, and no one had ever named it before. 3 days after the storm, Curtis Webb came to her with a problem. He came to her, rather than Caleb, which told her something about how the ranch's internal map had shifted, and she filed that away without comment. "We lost 6 head of cattle in the north pasture," he said. "Not to the storm, before it. I think someone cut the fence line." She looked at him. "Before the storm," she said. "Day before, maybe 2 days before. Hard to say exactly when because we weren't checking that line, too much else going on with storm preparation." "Have you told Caleb?" "I'm telling you first," he said. "Because whoever cut that fence, they knew exactly where to cut it. They knew which stretch of fence was furthest from where we were working. They knew our routine." The silence between them was significant. "Graham," she said. "That's my thought," Curtis said. "Can't prove it. Someone with 5 years of knowledge of this ranch," she said. "Someone who knew exactly how to hurt it and exactly when to do it right before a storm, so the damage would be compounded." "That's what I figure." She was quiet for a moment. "Go tell Caleb," she said. "Not because I'm not listening, but because he needs to hear this directly from you. And tell him exactly what you told me, including why you think it was deliberate." Curtis nodded. He started to leave. "Curtis," she said. He turned. "You did right coming to someone," she said. "Whatever happens next, you did right." He held her gaze for a moment. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Caleb's reaction to the fence line news was the cold, compressed fury she was coming to recognize as his most serious register. He didn't say much when Curtis told him. He asked 2 precise questions. He looked at the numbers. He came to the kitchen that evening, and she could see it in him the moment he walked through the door, the weight of it, The added weight on top of everything else the storm had already cost him. She poured coffee. She sat down across from him. "Tell me what you're thinking," she said. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that I trusted a man for 5 years who was taking from me the entire time. And when I found out he didn't just leave, he cut my fence and cost me 6 head of cattle and let the storm do the rest of the work." "Yes. I'm thinking about how much of the last 2 years of difficulty was how much of it was him," he said. "The men leaving, the morale, the supplies running short. I thought it was the market. I thought it was just a hard season." "Some of it was," she said. "Markets are real. Hard seasons are real. But some of it was him. Yes." He pressed his hand flat on the table, looked at it. "I built this ranch," he said. "My father and I built it. He died, and I kept building it. I have put 20 years of my life into this ground." He stopped. "And I let someone stand next to me for 5 of those years and hollow it out from the inside because I didn't look closely enough." "Caleb," she said. He looked up. "You are not responsible for someone else's decision to deceive you," she said. "Trust is not foolishness. It's what allows anything to function. If Graham Pike chose to abuse yours, that is entirely on him, not on you." "That's a generous way to look at it." "It's an accurate one," she said. "You can spend your energy on guilt about trusting the wrong person, or you can spend it on building something better. The first option changes nothing. The second changes everything." He held her gaze. "You've said something like that to me before," he said. "I'll probably say it again," she said, "until it sticks." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. Warmer than that. "You are the most direct person I have ever met in my life," he said. "Is that a complaint?" she said. "No," he said. He stopped. "It's one of the things I'm most grateful for." She looked down at her coffee cup. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the ranch was settling into the evening. She was aware in a way she had been trying not to be entirely aware of how different this was from anything she had experienced before. Not the work. The work she knew. The being seen in the work that was different. The sitting across from someone at the end of a hard day and talking about real things. The being heard. She had not had that in a very long time. Maybe not ever, she thought, in quite this way. "Nell," he said. She looked up. "When I hired you," he said carefully, "I told you we'd talk about wages in the morning, and then things kept happening, and I've given you more responsibility, which we did discuss, but I haven't the wages themselves." "Caleb," she said, "I trust that you'll be fair." "I want to make sure you know," he said, "that what you're doing here, what you've built here in a month, I am aware of what it's worth." She looked at him. "A month," she said. He looked at her. "Is it not?" He paused. "I've lost track, to be honest. With the storm and everything before." "It'll be 5 weeks on Thursday," she said. He shook his head slowly. 5 weeks, he said. "It feels like—" He stopped. "Longer," she said. "Like you've always been here," he said. She felt that land somewhere in her chest. Felt it in the particular way you feel things that are true and that you were not prepared for. "I'll take that as a compliment," she said. "It is one," he said. "The most honest one I know how to give." She stood up before she could say something she wasn't ready to say. She went to the stove and checked the fire, which didn't need checking, and gave herself 30 seconds of facing away from him to put everything back where it belonged. "Good night, Caleb," she said. "Good night, Nell." She heard him leave. She stood at the stove for another minute before she moved. The twist came from a direction she hadn't anticipated, and it came 12 days after the storm on a Tuesday morning, when a man she had never seen before rode into the yard and asked for Caleb Mercer. She saw him from the kitchen window, not something. She made a habit of watching the yard, but something had drawn her eye. He was well dressed for a ranch visit, not a working man, the kind of dressed that meant money or authority or both. She didn't think more about it. She had biscuits to make. Caleb came to the kitchen at noon, and he was different. Not dramatically, not the way you are different when something enormous has happened. More subtle. Like something had been set down somewhere, and he wasn't sure yet whether he'd be able to pick it back up. She put food in front of him and waited. He ate for a few minutes without talking. Then, "The man who came this morning." "I saw him ride in," she said. "His name is Franklin Holt. He's a land agent. He represents a group of investors out of Denver." She was quiet. "They're interested in Redstone Valley Ranch," Caleb said. She understood immediately what that meant. "They want to buy it," she said. "They want to make an offer," he said. Holt was careful about the wording. "But yes, they've been watching the ranch for a year apparently. The difficulties of the last 2 seasons, the staff turnover, the storm damage. He came out here to see if—" He stopped. "To see if I was ready to consider options." She looked at him. "What did you say?" she said. "I said I'd think about it," he said. She sat down across from him. "What are you thinking?" she said. "I'm thinking," he said, "that the number he mentioned it would clear the debt. It would clear it entirely and leave enough to start over somewhere smaller. Somewhere—" He stopped. "Somewhere that doesn't have 20 years of everything I've built and lost into it." She was very still. "And what is the alternative?" she said. "The alternative is what we've been doing," he said. "Rebuilding, a piece at a time, the way you said." He looked at her. "It's slow, and it's uncertain, and there's a real possibility that—" He stopped again. "That it doesn't work," she said. "Yes. And if you sell—" "It's done," he said. "It's certain, it's gone, but it's done." She looked at the table between them. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "If your father were here," she said, "what would he say?" The silence that followed was the longest one she had ever sat in with Caleb Mercer. "He would say," Caleb said finally very quietly, "that a man who sells what he built because it got hard is not a man who deserved to build it." "Is that what you believe?" she said. He looked at her. "I don't know what I believe right now," he said. "I believed in Graham Pike. I believed the ranch was sound when it wasn't. His jaw tightened. "I'm not sure my judgment is the thing to rely on at this particular moment." And there it was. The thing underneath the surface of everything. The real wound that Graham Pike had left. Not the money, not the cattle, not the fence line. The wound to Caleb Mercer's trust in his own judgment. She had known it was there. She hadn't known how deep it went. "Caleb," she said. He looked at her. "Your judgment," she said slowly and clearly, "is what hired me when you had no reason to. It's what listened when I told you about your men. It's what recognized what the ledger numbers meant when I put them in front of you. It's what kept 23 men alive through a blizzard." She held his gaze. Graham Pike was one bad decision. One. Against how many good ones? He didn't answer. "You are not your worst mistake," she said. "No one is." He looked down at the table. His hands were flat on the surface. She could see the tension in them. "Don't sell it," she said. And then, because she understood that she was saying something beyond her role and she was going to say it anyway, "Please, don't sell it." He looked up sharply. "Why?" he said. She met his eyes. "Because everything that happened here, everything that's been rebuilt these past 5 weeks, it happened here. In this specific place. With these specific men. If you take those men and scatter them and sell this land to investors who will run cattle on it without knowing a single one of their names." She stopped. "All of it is gone. Not just the ranch. All of it." The room was very still. "And you," he said. His voice was quiet. "If I sell—" She looked at him. "I find another open door," she said. "That's what I do." "I don't want you to find another door," he said. The words came out without preparation, and she could see the moment they were out that he hadn't fully planned to say them. She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them moved for a long moment. "Then don't give me a reason to look for one," she said. He held her gaze. Then he nodded. Once. Slow. "I'll send word to Holt tomorrow," he said. "The ranch isn't for sale." She exhaled. "Good," she said. She got up and went back to the stove, and she was aware that her hands were not entirely steady, and she was also aware that she didn't entirely mind. What happened next arrived in a form she had not predicted, and it arrived in the shape of a woman. Her name was Margaret Aldous. She appeared at the ranch the following Saturday afternoon, and she arrived not with the hesitance of a visitor, but with the particular self-possessed assurance of someone who had been here before and considered herself to have standing. She was 50-something handsome, in the sharp-edged way of women who had built their own authority, and she swept through the front door with the confidence of someone who had not been turned away from many gates. She was Robert Aldous's sister, Caleb's late business partner. She explained to Caleb in the front parlor, come to discuss what she considered to be a still outstanding matter relating to her brother's stake in the ranch, a matter her lawyer had been corresponding about and which Caleb had apparently not responded to in some months. Nell heard this from the kitchen. She was not eavesdropping. The walls of the ranch house were not thick. She heard Caleb's voice controlled, measured with that compressed quality that meant he was working to stay composed. She heard Margaret Aldous's voice, precise and not unkind, but entirely firm, the voice of a woman who was accustomed to being taken seriously. She kept cooking. But she listened because this was information about the ranch, and the ranch was her concern. What she pieced together was this: Robert Aldous had owned a stake in Redstone Valley Ranch. When he died, that stake technically became part of his estate. Margaret, as his closest surviving relative, had an interest in it. There had been some agreement apparently, or some expectation of an agreement, that had not been formalized before Robert died, and what was and wasn't owed was a matter that was now legally murky enough to require either a settlement or a fight. Caleb came to the kitchen 20 minutes later. She could see it all over him. "How bad?" she said without turning from the stove. "I don't know yet," he said. "I need to find a lawyer." "Is her claim legitimate?" A pause. "Possibly," he said. "Robert and I had an understanding about what his share was worth and what would happen to it. But it wasn't we didn't put it in writing because we were partners, because I trusted him. And now she's claiming the understanding her brother described to her was different from my understanding," he said. "In her version, the amount owed is significantly larger." Nell turned from the stove and looked at him. "Significantly larger meaning?" "Meaning," he said carefully, "that if she's right, and if a court agrees with her, the debt it creates is large enough that—" He stopped. "That you'd have to sell," she said. He met her eyes. "Yes," he said. The silence in the kitchen was its own third presence. She thought about the conversation 2 weeks ago, about Franklin Holt and his investor group and Caleb's decision to keep the ranch. She thought about what it had taken to get him to that decision. "What do you know about what Robert told her?" she said. "Almost nothing," he said. "Robert and his sister were close. He wrote to her. I don't know what he said." "Do you have any of your own records? Your correspondence with Robert? Any written record of the actual understanding between you?" He was quiet. "I have letters," he said slowly. "Robert and I wrote to each other often. Even when we were both here, he'd leave notes. He had a habit of writing things down." She looked at him. "Then find the letters," she said. "You think it's in there. I think if a man wrote things down habitually, and if the understanding between you was what you say it was, then somewhere in 20 years of letters and notes, there is something that reflects the real arrangement." She held his gaze. "Find it. Tonight. Before this goes any further." He looked at her for a moment. Then he turned and walked to the back of the house. She heard him in what must have been his office, and then further back, what must have been a storage room. The particular sounds of a person going through boxes, through old papers, through the accumulated physical record of a life and a partnership. She served supper. She told Thomas when he asked where Caleb was that he was handling some business. She managed the kitchen and the men and the evening, and she kept a plate warm on the back of the stove without saying anything about it. He came back at 9:30. He was holding a letter. He set it on the table in front of her, and she read it. It was in Robert Aldous's handwriting, slanted quick, the writing of a man who thought fast, dated 4 years ago. It was a letter to Caleb, and it discussed the terms of their arrangement at length. It was clear, specific, and the number it named was substantially different from the one Margaret Aldous was claiming. She read it twice. "This is it," she said. "There are 3 more like it," he said. "Going back 8 years, all consistent." She looked up at him. "Then you have your answer," she said. "I need a lawyer to say so officially," he said. "But yes, I think yes." She stood up and got the plate from the back of the stove and set it in front of him. He looked at the food, looked at her. "You kept it warm," he said. "Of course I did," she said. He sat down. He picked up his fork. He set it back down. "Nell," he said. She looked at him. "I want to tell you something, and I want you to let me finish before you redirect me to practical matters," he said. She felt something shift in her chest. "All right," she said. "I have been running this ranch alone for 2 years," he said. "I told myself I preferred it that way. I told myself that needing someone was a vulnerability, that depending on a person meant giving them the ability to diminish you." He looked at his hands. "Graham Pike is what happens when you trust badly. I decided the answer to that was not to trust at all." He looked up. "And then you showed up at my gate," he said, "and I almost sent you away. And every day since then you have shown me something I—" He stopped. "You have shown me that the problem was never trust itself. The problem was that I didn't know what to look for." She was very still. "And what do you look for?" she said carefully. "Someone who looks at the real numbers," he said. "Someone who says true things even when they're hard. Someone who stays at the stove for 11 hours in a blizzard, because that's the thing that needs doing." He held her gaze. "Someone who tells me not to sell my ranch because she understands what it cost me to build it." She looked at him. The kitchen fire crackled. Outside the ranch was quiet. In the particular way it got quiet after a hard week. Men settled animals, settled everything in its place. "Caleb," she said. "I know," he said. "I know you'll tell me you're practical. I know you'll tell me not to make this something it isn't." He paused. "I'm asking you not to. Not tonight." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the woman who had arrived at this gate 5 weeks ago with a recipe tin and $4.62. She thought about what that woman had told herself. She needed safety. Wages, a place to work. Nothing more complicated than that. She thought about how the heart was the most inconvenient organ in the human body, and how it had never once in her life asked her permission before it decided something. "I'm not going to tell you to make it something it isn't either," she said finally. He looked at her. "But I'm going to tell you," she said, "that I am someone who needs to stand on her own ground. Who needs to know that what I have here is mine earned, not given. You understand the difference?" "Yes," he said. "Better than most." "Then we understand each other," she said. She held out her hand across the table, not the way she had when they'd shaken on the kitchen accounts. Something different. Something that was an acknowledgement rather than a transaction. He looked at it. He took it. His hand was warm and steady around hers, and he held it for a moment longer than a handshake, and neither of them let go immediately, and the kitchen fire burned low and bright, and outside the Colorado night was cold and vast and full of stars. "Eat your supper," she said, "before it gets cold." He laughed. A real one. She felt it in the hand that was still holding hers. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She pulled her hand back. She stood up. She went to the stove. And behind her, she heard him pick up his fork, and she heard the quiet sounds of the kitchen in the evening, and she let herself feel just for this moment the full and complicated weight of something that had started in the mud outside a gate and had grown without her permission into something she hadn't known she was looking for. She wasn't done being careful. She wasn't done being the person who kept her feet under her and her eyes open. But she was, for the first time in a very long time, exactly where she was supposed to be. The lawyer arrived from Denver on a Wednesday. His name was Samuel Pratt, and Caleb had written to him the morning after finding Robert's letters. Pratt was a small, precise man who carried a leather case and spoke in careful sentences that never wasted a word, and Nell liked him immediately for that. She served him coffee when he arrived, and he thanked her with the particular courtesy of a man who actually noticed the people who served him, which was rarer than it should have been. He sat with Caleb in the front office for 2 hours. Nell did not listen at the wall this time. She had her work, and she did it, and she trusted that Caleb would tell her what she needed to know. He came to the kitchen when Pratt left. She looked at his face before he said a word. "It's good news," she said. "It's good news," he confirmed. He sat down. "The letters are clear enough that Pratt believes any reasonable court would side with my account of the arrangement. He's going to write to Margaret Aldis's lawyer this week and lay it out." He paused. "He thinks she'll settle. He thinks she may not have known her brother's actual terms. That what she was claiming was what she believed Robert had told her, not what he actually arranged." Nell thought about that. "Then she wasn't lying," she said. "No, just mistaken. And certain in the way people are certain when they're grieving someone, and all they have left is what they remember being told." She was quiet. "That changes how you feel about it," she said. "Not a question." "It changes how I want to handle it," he said. "Pratt's letter will be firm, but I told him not aggressive. She lost her brother. She's not a villain." Nell looked at him. This was the thing about Caleb Mercer that she kept encountering from new angles. This fundamental decency that sat underneath the composed surface and the hard-learned caution. The ability to look at someone who had threatened everything he'd built and still extend toward them the consideration of their full humanity. "You're a fair man," she said. He looked slightly uncomfortable the way he always did when she said something that was plainly true and plainly about him. "I'm trying to be," he said. "That's all any of us can do," she said. She set a biscuit in front of him. He ate it without comment, which was its own kind of commentary, because in 5 weeks she had learned that Caleb Mercer only ate without speaking when something was taking up too much space in him for food to compete. "What else?" she said. He looked up. "I want to talk about the ranch," he said. "About going forward. About what we're actually building here." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat. "Then talk," she said. He laid it out methodically, the way he did everything. "Start with the real numbers. No softening. No illusions." The debt was manageable. The storm damage was significant, but not catastrophic. The cattle losses from the cut fence were recoverable by spring. The supply situation, which she had reorganized and was now running efficiently, had already saved him more money in 6 weeks than Graham Pike had stolen in 6 months. That last part she hadn't known. She looked at him when he said it. "I went back through the full 2 years of records," he said. "After Pratt helped me understand the accounting side. The savings from your management, the waste reduction, the better supplier negotiations, the inventory control." He paused. "You've been paying for yourself several times over." "I was doing my job," she said. "You were doing far more than your job," he said. "Which is why I want to—" He stopped, restarted. "I want to offer you a formal role, not just cook, not just supply manager, something." He stopped again. She watched him search for the word. "Partner," he said finally. The word landed in the kitchen like something with weight. She looked at him. "That's a significant word," she said. "I mean it significantly," he said. He was watching her carefully. I'm not asking you to, this isn't about—" He stopped, and she saw him make himself be clear. "I mean a business arrangement, a genuine partnership, your name on the management of this ranch, authority over the household operations, the supply chain, the welfare of the men, real authority documented, not dependent on my goodwill." "And if someday your goodwill changes," she said, "then you'd have legal standing," he said. "You'd have something that's yours regardless." She understood what he was doing. He was giving her the thing she had said she needed, ground that was hers, earned not given. He had heard her. He had thought about it carefully and come back with something concrete. She looked at the table. She thought about the woman who had walked into this ranch with nothing, who had been told she had no place here, who had rebuilt this kitchen and rebuilt the spirit of the men in it, and found a theft and managed a crisis and held the center of everything through a blizzard, and not once been given anything she hadn't first proven she deserved. She thought about what it meant to say yes to this. "I need to think about it," she said. "I know," he said. He wasn't disappointed. He'd expected it. Take whatever time you need. She nodded. She went back to the stove. But her hands moving through the familiar motions were not entirely steady, and she was glad she was facing away from him. She thought about it for 3 days. She thought about it the way she thought about the most serious things, not constantly, but in the way it moved in and out of her attention. The way important questions do surfacing, when her hands were busy with something routine, retreating when she needed full focus surfacing again. Thomas Reed was the one she talked to. She hadn't planned it that way. It happened because he came into the kitchen on the second evening and found her standing at the counter, staring at nothing. With a bowl of batter she'd forgotten she was holding, and he said very carefully, "Miss Whitaker, are you all right?" And she said, "Thomas, what do you think of this ranch?" He blinked. "What do I think of it?" he said. "As a place to be. As a place that could be worth building." Howe was quiet for a moment, thinking about it with the seriousness he brought to things. 6 weeks ago, he said, I thought it was just a job, a place I was passing through until something better turned up. He looked at the kitchen. Now. He stopped. I wrote to my cousin in Missouri last week. Told him I thought I'd found a place worth staying. She looked at him. What changed? She said. He looked at her steadily. You know what changed, he said. She did. On the third day, she went to Caleb's office. She knocked. She came in. She closed the door behind her. He was at his desk, and he looked up, and he read her face, and he set down his pen. I have conditions, she said. Something in him relaxed very slightly, which told her he'd been more uncertain about her answer than he'd let on. Tell me, he said. My name is on the document as an equal partner in ranch management, she said. Not a subordinate role with a generous title. Equal. Agreed, he said. My wages are set at a figure we both negotiate, not one you determine alone, and they're reviewed every 6 months. Agreed. If I see something wrong in the accounts and the operations in the treatment of the men, I say so, directly, and I'm heard, not managed. He held her gaze. I would expect nothing less, he said. She looked at him. And this arrangement, she said carefully, is separate from anything else that may or may not develop between us. It stands on its own. If everything else went wrong... She stopped. You'd still have your ground, he said. Yes, Nell, that is exactly the point. She let out a breath. Then yes, she said. I accept. He stood up from behind the desk and extended his hand. She crossed the room and shook it, and it was different from the other times, from the business handshake over the kitchen accounts and the reaching across the table in the firelight. This was both of those things, and something beyond them, the formal acknowledgement of something that had been true for weeks, finally being given its proper name. Welcome to Redstone Valley Ranch, he said. Officially. I've been here for 5 weeks, she said. Then it's overdue, he said. She almost laughed. She did actually, a small one, and she saw it surprise him, and then he was smiling too. That real smile she had learned to watch for, the one that started slow and changed his whole face. She went back to her kitchen. She stood in it and looked at it, the cleaned stove, the organized shelves, the fire she had kept burning every day since she arrived. Hers now, in the only way that mattered. Graham Pike came back on a Friday. She was in the supply barn doing the weekly inventory when she heard the gate, and when she came around the corner of the barn, she saw him. He was on horseback, which meant he wasn't a man coming to beg. He rode in like a man who still thought he had something to say. Caleb was in the yard. She stayed where she was. She watched. She couldn't hear the words from that distance, but she could read the shape of the conversation, Graham talking first. Something that had the posture of justification, of explaining. Caleb listening. Caleb still the way he went still when he was being deliberate rather than reactive. Then Caleb talking. Graham's body changed. Something went out of him. He turned his horse and rode out the gate without looking back. Caleb stood in the yard for a moment. Then he turned and saw Nell by the barn. He walked to her. What did he want? She said. A reference, Caleb said. He needs work, and he needs someone to speak for his years here. What did you say? Caleb looked at the gate. I said I'd confirm his employment dates and his role, he said. I would not speak to his character. She nodded. That's fair, she said. He asked, Caleb paused. He asked if it was you who found the ledger discrepancies. What did you tell him? The truth, Caleb said. That I asked someone to organize the records, and they did their job thoroughly. She looked at him. He didn't say anything to that. He said, Caleb said slowly, she's smarter than I gave her credit for. The silence held for a moment. High praise from Graham Pike, she said. The highest he's capable of, Caleb said. She picked up her inventory ledger and went back to work. But she allowed herself walking back into the supply barn. One brief moment of something that was not quite satisfaction, but was in the same neighborhood. She had never needed Graham Pike to respect her, but she was human enough to notice when he did. The real shift at Redstone Valley Ranch happened quietly, the way the most important things always do. It wasn't a single day or a single decision. It was the accumulation of weeks of suppers that were good enough that men stopped thinking of the table as a place to fuel up and started thinking of it as a place they wanted to be. Of mornings that began with something warm and made with genuine attention. Of a kitchen that had become, in the way Nell had told Caleb, it could become the actual center of the ranch. Pete Hollis's knee was seen by a doctor who came through Hartfield in November. The diagnosis was what she had suspected, damage that had been made significantly worse by months of overcompensation. The doctor gave him a course of treatment and a list of things to avoid, and Caleb, without being asked, reorganized Pete's work assignment around both. Pete said nothing about it to Caleb directly, but he came to the kitchen the evening after it happened, and he sat down at the table and he said to Nell, "Thank you for not letting it go. You're a good man and a good worker," she said. "Losing you would have cost this ranch more than the doctor did." "That's a practical reason," he said. "It's also not the only reason," she said. "But I knew you'd be more comfortable with the practical one." He looked at her for a moment. Then he smiled, a slow, real smile that she hadn't seen from him before. "You know us all too well," he said. "I'm working on it," she said. Curtis Webb stopped talking about leaving. It happened so gradually that she almost missed the precise moment when it became simply a fact. The man who had his bags half packed was now the man who took the most pride in the north pasture fence he'd rebuilt after Graham's sabotage. He repaired it himself, every post, and when he was done, he walked the entire length of it, and she saw him do it from the kitchen window, and understood that he was doing what people do when they've decided somewhere is theirs. He was walking the boundary of it. Thomas Reed was a different story, and a better one. Caleb gave him more responsibility in November, not dramatically, not with a speech, just by beginning to include him in decisions about the younger horses, which Thomas had a particular gift for. Thomas came to breakfast one morning with something different in his face, and it took her most of the day to identify what it was. He looked like someone who'd been seen, not noticed. Seen. The particular thing that happens when another person looks at what you're capable of and responds to what's actually there rather than what you appear to be on the surface. She understood that feeling. She was living in it. The first real snowfall of the season came in late November, soft and early, and the ranch woke up white and quiet. She stood in the kitchen doorway with her coffee in both hands and felt the cold air and looked at the yard and thought about the morning she had stood at the gate in the mud, and the distance between that morning and this one felt both impossibly long and also like no time at all. Caleb appeared at her shoulder. She hadn't heard him come up behind her. "You're going to let all the warm air out," he said. "I'm looking at something," she said. He looked at the yard, at the snow. "What are you looking at?" he said. She thought about it. "The distance," she said, "between where I was and where I am." He was quiet beside her. "And," he said. "And it's further than I thought," she said. In the best possible way. He reached past her and closed the kitchen door, which required him to stand very close behind her for a moment, and she was aware of that closeness. The way you're aware of something warm when you've been cold for a long time. "Come inside," he said. "It's cold." She came inside. And the twist that she had not seen coming arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in December, and it came in the form of a letter. She was at the kitchen table going over the supply accounts when the ranch hand who'd ridden to Hartfield for the weekly mail run dropped the post on the counter. She sorted through it without looking carefully. Caleb's correspondence, which she'd hand to him at supper, a delivery confirmation she'd been expecting, and then a letter addressed to her. The handwriting was familiar in the way that something you've spent years trying to forget is still familiar. A name in the return address she had not seen written down in 3 years. Her hands stopped. She set the letter on the table. She looked at it for a long time. Then she picked it up and opened it. It was from the family in Denver. The family who had dismissed her without wages and called her a thief and told her to leave the city. Specifically, it was from the wife Catherine Beaumont, and it was 3 pages long, and Nell read every word twice. The summary of it was this: Catherine Beaumont's husband had confessed. Not to everything, not in the detail that Nell would have wanted, but enough. He had admitted that the accusation against Nell had been false, that he had pressured Catherine to dismiss Nell to protect himself, that Nell had done nothing wrong. Catherine was writing to say she was sorry. She was also writing to say that she had told her husband's business associates the truth, and that her husband's reputation in Denver was now significantly diminished, and that she thought Nell should know. Nell sat at the table with the letter in her hands. She thought about the woman who had walked out of the Beaumont household with nothing, who had been unable to defend herself because she had no one to stand beside her, who had walked 11 miles in worn-out boots to a gate that was closed in her face because there was nowhere else to go. She thought about what an apology was worth. She thought about what it cost someone to write one. She folded the letter carefully. She put it in her apron pocket. Then she went back to the supply accounts. That evening after supper, when the kitchen was quiet and Caleb was at the table with his coffee, she took the letter out and put it in front of him. "Read this," she said, "if you want to." He read it. He was quiet for a long time. "The family in Denver," he said. "Yes. This is why you couldn't stay there," he said. "Why you couldn't get another position." "Yes." He put the letter down. "Nell," he said. "It's done," she said. "It was done before I came here. I'm not—" She stopped. "I don't need you to be angry on my behalf." "I am anyway," he said, very quietly. She looked at him. "I know," she said. "What will you do with it?" he said. She thought about it. "Nothing," she said. "I don't need to do anything with it. She wrote it. He confessed it. The truth is known to the people it matters to." She looked at the letter on the table. "I spent 3 years carrying the weight of a lie someone told about me. I'm not carrying it anymore." Caleb reached across the table and picked up the letter and handed it back to her. "You never should have had to carry it in the first place," he said. She took the letter. She looked at it one more time. Then she stood up and walked to the stove and opened the fire door and put the letter in. She watched it burn. "There," she said. Behind her she heard Caleb exhale a slow, deliberate breath, like he'd been holding something on her behalf and was now releasing it. "Come sit down," he said. She sat down. "I want to tell you something," he said. "And unlike last time, I'm not asking you to not redirect me to practical matters." She looked at him. "All right," she said. "I have been thinking," he said carefully, "about what kind of man I want to be. Not what kind of rancher. Not what kind of businessman. What kind of man." He held her gaze. "I want to be the kind of man who is worthy of the trust of the people around him. I want to be the kind of man who looks closely enough to see what's actually there." He paused. "I have spent 2 years learning the hard way what it looks like when someone is not those things. And I've spent 6 weeks learning every day what it looks like when someone is." She was very still. "You're going to embarrass me," she said. "You are the least embarrassable person I have ever met," he said. "But I want to say it anyway." He looked at her. "You walked into this ranch and you made it. You made it somewhere worth being. For 23 men who had stopped believing that. For me." He stopped. "You did that, not the biscuits. You." She looked at the table. "The biscuits helped," she said. He laughed. "A full one, not the compressed version." "Yes," he said. "The biscuits helped." She looked up. "Caleb," she said. "Nell," he said. "I am going to say something practical now," she said. "Because I need to." "Say it." "I am not a woman who does things halfway," she said. "I am not a woman who keeps one foot out the door as a precaution. When I commit to something, a kitchen, a ranch, a person, I commit entirely." She held his gaze. "So if you are going to tell me something, I need you to be sure of it. Not hopeful. Sure." He looked at her for a long moment. "I am sure," he said. She believed him. She believed him because she had learned in 6 weeks what Caleb Mercer's certainty looked like versus his uncertainty, and this was the former. "Then we understand each other," she said. "We've understood each other for a while," he said. "I know," she said. "I was just waiting for the words to catch up." He reached across the table. She put her hand in his, and there it was. Not a dramatic thing, not a declaration in front of witnesses, or a scene that would be talked about. Just two people sitting at a kitchen table with the fire going. Their hands together, having arrived by different roads, through different kinds of hardship, at the same place, at the same time. The months that followed were the hardest work of Nell Whitaker's life, and also the best. Spring came to Redstone Valley Ranch like a reprieve. The cattle that had been lost were partially recovered, 4 of the 6 found on neighboring rangeland, which was its own small miracle. The supply operation running under Nell's full authority had cut costs by a figure that made Samuel Pratt whistle when he reviewed the accounts in March. The debt from the Graham Pike years was on a payment schedule that was aggressive but achievable. Margaret Aldous settled in February. The settlement was, as Pratt had predicted, substantially less than her initial claim, close to the number Robert's letters established. Caleb paid it without complaint. He wrote Margaret a personal letter alongside the formal documents, and Nell read it before he sent it and said, "This is good," and meant it fully. Margaret wrote back, brief, formal, but not unkind. It was not reconciliation. But it was the absence of enmity, which was its own kind of peace. Thomas Reed turned 18 in March, and Caleb gave him a small wage increase, and a formal title, and the responsibility of the remuda. The ranch's horses, and Thomas received it with the particular solemnity of someone who understands the weight of being trusted. He came to the kitchen afterward. He sat down across from Nell. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "When I came here," he said, "I was going to leave. I told you that. I had my things half packed." "I remember. And the reason I stayed, I know I said it was the biscuits, but that wasn't really—" He stopped. "It was that you looked at me, like you expected something from me. Not in a demanding way. More like you could see something that I hadn't shown anyone yet." He looked at his hands. "I'd never had anyone look at me like that before." She was quiet. "Your mother looked at you like that," she said. He shook his head. "My mother died when I was 12. She hadn't known that." "Then I'm sorry it took until now," she said, "for someone to look at you that way." He didn't cry. He was 18 and too proud for that. But his jaw worked for a moment, and she looked back down at what she was doing and gave him the privacy of that. "Thank you, Miss Whitaker," he said. "Nell," she said. He looked up. "You can call me Nell," she said. "You've earned it." He nodded. He stood up. At the door he turned back. "Miss Nell," he said. "Are you happy here?" She looked around the kitchen. At the organized shelves, the good stove, the fire she kept burning every morning before the sun came up. At the recipe tin that sat on the shelf above the prep table, the place she had put it on her first day and had not moved it since. She thought about the gate, about the mud, about standing up when she hadn't been sure she could. She thought about Caleb's hand across the table, about the letter she had burned, about Thomas's face when Caleb gave him the horses. She thought about her mother's handwriting on a faded index card and the note at the bottom that said, "Always make more than you think you need. There is always someone hungrier than you expect." "Yes," she said, and she meant it without reservation, without the fine print of mostly, or getting there, or in some ways. She meant it the way she had learned to mean things completely, with her eyes open, knowing exactly what it had cost, and deciding it was worth every penny. Thomas Reed nodded once satisfied and walked out. She turned back to the stove. Outside the spring was coming. She could feel it in the air that came through the window, that particular quality of Colorado air in late March when the worst is over and the world is deciding to try again. Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway. She didn't turn around. She knew his footsteps. Thomas looked pleased, he said. He's a good young man, she said. He is, Caleb said. We were lucky to keep him. We were, she said. He came into the kitchen and stood beside her, and they were quiet together for a moment, which was one of the things she had come to love about him, the quality of the silence he could share. It wasn't empty. It was full of everything that didn't need saying. I was thinking, he said. About what? About what this place is going to look like in 10 years, he said. If we keep doing what we're doing. She looked at the fire. Tell me, she said. He talked. About cattle, about land, about what a well-run operation could build in a decade if the fundamentals were sound. About the men who were loyal now, and what that loyalty was worth. About the things he wanted to do differently than his father had done them, and the things he wanted to keep exactly the same. She listened. She added things. She pushed back on 2 points, and he pushed back on one of hers, and they worked through it, the way they worked through everything directly without performance, because they had both learned that honest friction between people who respected each other produced better outcomes than comfortable agreement. It was, she thought, the best kind of partnership. At the end of it, he said, What do you want in 10 years? What does it look like for you? She thought about it carefully. I want this kitchen, she said. With better shelving on the east wall, I've been meaning to tell you about that. I want Thomas Reed to be running something significant on this ranch, and I want to have been a part of teaching him how. I want the men here to know every day that the work they do matters and that someone has thought about what they need. She paused. And I want to be the person writing down the recipes. He looked at her. Your mother's tin, he said. And everything I've added to it, she said. Everything I've learned here. I want there to be something that remains. Something someone could find in 20 years and know that this was a kitchen where people were cared for, where something good was made every day. She stopped. I want to leave something behind. Caleb was quiet. You already have, he said. She looked at him. You've been here 6 months, he said. And this ranch it's not the same place. The men are not the same men. I am not the same man. He held her gaze. Whatever happens in the next 10 years, that is already true. She felt it, the full weight of it, the real weight of it, settling somewhere in her chest and staying there. She had walked 11 miles in worn-out boots with $4 and a recipe tin and been told she was nothing. She had gotten up out of the mud and walked through an open door and done the only thing she had ever known how to do, looked closely worked, honestly cared without apology, and made something good. And it had been enough. More than enough. She turned back to the stove. She had biscuits to make. The recipe was her mother's, and it was hers. And someday it would belong to someone she had not yet met, who would stand in a kitchen somewhere and make something good for someone who needed it. And the chain of it would continue forward in the only way that anything truly essential ever does not, through monuments or declarations, but through one person's hands and another person's hunger, and the daily, unremarkable, quietly miraculous act of showing up and doing the work. Nell Whitaker had arrived at Redstone Valley Ranch with nothing. She left it with everything that mattered, and she never left it at all.